Welcome to the Clear Admit MBA Admissions Academy. I'm Graham Richmond, and I'm joined by Alex Brown for this lesson on interviews. It's our third lesson on interviews, and it's sort of centralized around common questions that you might experience, as well as some preparation tips. So Alex, let's get into it. There are a set of really common questions that you'd be really foolish not to have thought through before an interview, right? So what are these questions? There are a handful of them. Let's go through them.
The standard one is walk me through your resume. It could come in a variety of variants, but you need to be prepared to have your sort of elevator pitch in terms of your resume, what you've done, how you've made decisions, in a reasonably concise format, maybe 30 seconds, a minute and a half, sort of navigating through your resume. You want to provide enough sort of source material, as it were, for then the interviewer to do some follow-up questions and probe some of the thoughts that you've addressed in that walk me through your resume question.
Yeah, so with walk me through your resume, you mentioned variants. Some schools just say, tell me about yourself.
Yeah.
I mean, there are all different ways that it can come in. And I think you're right on the concise side. You don't want to launch into a 20-minute soliloquy, where you're just walking them through everything. But I think, you need to spend enough time to give them your education, experience, and the key factors, as you said, the source materials. So another common question that people get is, what are your career goals?
Yeah. I'm just going to go back to that walk me through your resume real quick. So I just want to emphasize one point. It's when you go through your resume, make sure you deliver the whys behind the choices that you've made, not just the whats in terms of what you've done.
Yeah, the decisions.
That's really important.
Yeah,
yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so you're going to be asked about your career goals. Quite likely, right? Just as in your MBA essays, you're asked about your career goals, or in the data forms. This is key for schools. They want to know that you know why you're coming to the school and how it makes sense for the trajectory that you're putting forward for yourself. And it allows you to articulate to your interviewer that you're very thoughtful about this stuff, you've really thought through it, you understand how that particular school potentially makes absolute sense for both your short-term goal coming out of the school, as well as your long-term goal.
Yeah, and I think, on the one hand, some of it is almost like a checkpoint where they want to make sure that what you share meshes with what's in the essays, but also, I don't think anyone who's watched the Admissions Academy or tuned in on audio would do this, but I think in some cases a candidate's essay isn't as fleshed out, and so the school uses the interview as an opportunity to really get under the hood and find out more about these goals and see if the candidate can articulate a really clear path. So it's important to be able to explain, what are you going to do after business school, short-term, long-term, function, industry, maybe target companies, that kind of stuff. So having that ready. Another one, though, that schools ask quite often is, why our school? And that may be more than just related to the goals, although that could be a piece of it. But so what would you say to someone who's thinking about answering that question?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very important question to answer. I mean, quite frankly, the further down the pyramid of tiers that you go, the more likely that question is going to come up. They want to know, why our school? Because let's say you have an outstanding profile, they might be thinking, well, actually, this is a candidate that clearly can be considering our competitors. So we need to know that they've thought this through. And that fit question. And what you'll recognize to a lot of these questions is they're very similar to questions that we addressed in the essays portion of the Admissions Academy. And there's there's a reason for that, right? I mean, we're probing along the same lines. We're not necessarily using the interview to learn new stuff as much as we want to confirm, affirm the stories that have already been told. So make sure that you can answer why School X from a fit standpoint. Very important.
And would it be okay for me to say something like, well, I looked at the career report and the average salary is the highest of any school, and so is the bonus, and that's why I want to come here.
Yeah, and it's not about bonus, not about salary, it's not about ranking because you rank number one or whatever. Those are not the right answers. The right answers are much more about the academic experience fits with my goals, about the extracurricular experience fits with my goals. from a career management standpoint, it's about, I know that you do well in this industry.
Sure.
Right. So absolutely.
Okay, yeah, I just want to underline that because similar to essays, there's kind of some of these taboo type things you wouldn't say.
Yeah.
Oh, well, you guys were ranked number one in U.S. News, and that caught my eye.
Yeah.
So yeah, absolutely. Another really common question is where an admissions officer or whoever's conducting the interview might say, "Tell me about a leadership experience." How does one prepare for that? And
I mean, again, it's kind of like the work you did for your essays. Some of the stories, you're going to use the same stories, the same anecdotes. There's no harm in that. Again, we talk about developing this personal inventory, and that in that personal inventory, you've talked about you address all your different sort of experiences and stories, both at work, in your extracurriculars, in your volunteer experiences, or whatever it might be. And that's great source material to answer these questions. So, frankly, your interviewer, if they haven't read your application, this goes back to our previous lesson, knowing your interview and the style of interview that's being taken place. If they haven't read your application, that it's just a resume-based interview, then all stories are fair game. It's absolutely fantastic. So use your best stories, and you should have identified that when you tackled your essays, and certainly identified it as you built out your personal inventory.
Yeah, and I would also just add that with a leadership anecdote that you're going to share, same thing with the essays. Use a kind of methodology to make sure that you're covering all the things. So set the situation, explain the tasks, the actions, and the results. So that's the STAR method. So using that as you deliver that kind of an answer is important. The last one that I wanted to ask you about is, schools will ask you about a time you failed. And again, we did talk about this in the context of essays, but it comes up in interviews too. What's any kind of ground rules here or things to keep in mind?
This is my favorite question when I was interviewing at Wharton, because you'd be interviewing some folks that are just super successful. Everything's always positive. So asking the failure question, sometimes it would derail them a little bit, right? Because it's like, oh wow, I've got to talk about something where I didn't necessarily succeed. But the rules are the same in terms of how we address this in the essays, and using that STAR or CAR method to sort of describe the situation, and the failure itself, what you learnt from it. That's critical, and how that sort of manifested in subsequent experiences. I can't overemphasize that you can't only focus on the failure. You have to focus on also the growth from the failure and what you brought to subsequent situations. I'm going to tell you, Graham, though, there's another question that we should address here.
Okay.
Not that maybe you have some additional stuff to add to the failure, which is fair game too, but also address the final question that all interviewers will always ask is, do you have any questions for me? How should that be addressed?
Yeah. So going back to the failure first, only thing I would add to that is, again, it shouldn't be something super recent, because as you say, great to be able to show a failure and then indicate what you'd learned and how you've even had some success because of the learning from that failure. So keeping it a little bit in the past is smart. As to the question about, do you have any questions for me? That is a really tricky one, only because I hear a lot of candidates say, gosh, I've done a ton of research. I'm prepared. I've written my applications. I've had conversations with alums, students. And so they're in the interview and they don't really have any questions, or they don't feel like they do. But I think you want to take advantage of your audience and who's interviewing you in that situation, and think, okay, is it a student? That's easy. Ask them about, what clubs are you in, or what's been something that surprised you about your experience at this program, or, just anything really to get them talking.
Anything, but don't ask them what's disappointed you about this program.
Right. Yeah.
There are some direct questions that are off limits.
Yeah. And I would say the same is true for an admissions officer. It's a bad idea to say, should I have any concerns about coming to this institution? That just is so pompous, right? Yeah. So, but I think knowing your audience is important. Obviously, the admissions officers know more about the admissions process, and so sometimes it's better to say to them, hey, given that my goals are in clean tech and, and particularly in Africa, is there, who could I talk to on campus? And they might say, oh, we've got, the head of the Africa Club, and there's a clean tech club, and, maybe you can talk to those two individuals, or whatever it might be. So, and then with alums, I think, easy, right? Get them to talk about their experience, and, or to what extent there are things happening in their city, if they're part of a local alumni club. that kind of thing. So just knowing your audience, but it would be very foolish to say, oh, I don't have any questions.
Yeah.
Because honestly, asking a question gives you a little bit of a chance to sort of showcase your interests, or, just by the nature of the question you're going to ask, it's a signaling mechanism. Yeah. So by asking about clean tech or, Africa, I'm signaling something to the admissions interviewer. So very important. I want to close out this lesson with some sort of advice around preparation, because we talk about these common questions and how you might approach them. But there are some really great ways to get ready for an MBA admissions interview. The first one I want you to talk about is ClearAdmit has an interview archive that you were the architect for. Yeah. So what do you have to say about that?
That I was the architect for it. I think it's absolutely brilliant. It was a wiki at the time. It's fantastic. Yeah. But joking aside, it's the largest interview archive on for business school interviews that's available. It's a must read. So basically, what are you going to get out of that? You're going to see the common questions that the individual schools that you're targeting are asking. So absolutely do that. I'll run through the rest of them real quick because I think they're important. And this is you emphasize this a lot. Practice with friends. I mean that's good. So practice. You're sort of interviewing. If you haven't got friends that you can do this with, I mean, there's lots of tech now. You can just do video interviewing and just re-watch it yourself and so forth. But also fundamentally, just know your application. So the best way to prepare the night before is go back and reread your essays. Know exactly how you articulated your candidacy for that particular school that you're interviewing. That's really important, especially for those interviews that are non-blind. So your Sloan's, your Harvard, Stern interviews, because they're going to pick an anecdote from that second paragraph in your third essay or something and do a deep dive on it. So be conscious of that. And finally, I don't think you can over-prepare for an interview. The more you prepare, the more relaxed you can be in the interview, but don't be scripted. That will not work.
Yeah, that is the big danger. And we see it all the time, especially with the virtual interviews that happen. You see people where it's obvious that they've basically prepared their remarks and they're reading from them and that is just a disaster. I think you're right, though. On some levels, going into an interview cold, doing nothing, at least you'll be you, but you will not excel. But you would be you and authentic, right? Because you're just going to kind of walk in. If you go in having done a little bit of work, but not enough, you might come in sounding stilted and like you're feeling for your thoughts about and it feels scripted. Yeah. Whereas if you get to that point where you know what you want to say, you're really comfortable, that's where you want to be.
That's perfect.
And just to really underline it, on our website, there is an archive of literally hundreds and hundreds of interview firsthand accounts where candidates have left them there. And so that is a vital resource that people should look into. Up next, we're going to get into another lesson on interviews. And this one is going to be on killer questions. So we did common, now we got to do killer. So you definitely want to watch that one.